Got it. And I'll show the chat too. All righty. So far we have 3 people. Let's give it a little bit longer. Hi, Steve. And you're here from Maryland, right?
Correct. Buenos dias.
Buenos dias. Just give it a couple more minutes. Hi, Bev and Jenny.
Hi.
And Bev's cat.
Welcome.
Did Ann make it to the breakout?
Not yet. I think she needs an intro to Zoom rather than an intro to Living Shorelines, but that's okay.
I have a feeling that a lot of people are going to be lost in the matrix.
Yeah, it's a little different trying to figure out your own way instead of just having somebody send you someplace.
Mm-hmm.
So really, this is just very basic, and we can cover a lot of some of the details that are being covered in the other breakout sessions, but we just thought we would start with a really basic intro to, and it's predominantly focused on living shorelines in Virginia. So not necessarily in Maryland. Sometimes the regulations are different, but it's good lessons learned for all of us, I think. So I'm Shereen Hughes. I'm Assistant Director of Wetlands Watch, which is a nonprofit in Norfolk, Virginia. And we work on promoting natural and nature-based features for resilience of wetlands due to sea level rise and climate adaptation, and also resilience in the landscape. And we work with, we do a lot of workforce development type trainings with this Chesapeake Bay Landscape Professional program. We're one of the consortium members. And we partner with the Elizabeth River Project all the time. So I'll let Barbara Gavin introduce herself.
Yes, so I am with ERP Elizabeth River Project. I manage the River Star Homes program. So it's our free homeowner program focused on improving things that we do that can impact water quality in the Elizabeth. But beyond that, we also contract with our local cities. Some of the people that are speaking today are in those contracts. And we also have federal funding from National Fish and Wildlife Foundation to actually help homeowners go a step further with their commitment to a cleaner Elizabeth by partaking projects like this one you see here. This is the photo in the background is a living shoreline that was done at a River Star Homes property over on the Eastern Branch in Virginia Beach. So with that, we utilize a lot of different partners. We work with homeowners, we work with the cities, we work with JRA, with CBLP, with everybody and anybody you can name. And helping homeowners pay for their projects is critical to getting them done.
Now, I would add that Barbara is a certified CBLP. And I forgot to mention that Wetlands Watch, a lot of our work is funded through other people's grants, but we also have a resilience grant through the RISE organization based in Norfolk. And so a lot of the work that we're doing, we're kind of bringing that source of funding along with other funding to the table to help meet our goals, our common goals. We're going to go through this quickly, and then we can actually just open up the mics for you guys to ask questions. It's such a small group, and we have some accessory type images and information beyond the 10 slides that we're going to share with you. So just first of all, what are living shorelines? They're a shoreline management practice that provides erosion control and water quality benefits. They protect, restore, and enhance natural shoreline habitats, and they maintain coastal processes through the strategic placement of plants, stone, sand fill, and other organic materials and other structural materials. We love this picture. It's a beautiful example of a living shoreline that was done by the Elizabeth River Project, Bay Environmental. It was done through collaboration, and Barbara's going to be talking about it later this afternoon. And a certified CBLP designed the buffer for it. And it's just a beautiful project. So at its most basic, living shorelines are planting vegetation, making slope and elevation adjustments, and then may have low elevation structures that are there to protect habitat and also protect your practice from washing away if you have some wave action. But there's a wide variety of living shorelines based on the tidal shoreline situation. So you might have, if you have a low bank height and calm conditions with low wave action and a wide tidal marsh, stable vegetation, then you might use more nature-based practices and less hard structures. As you get higher energy, you get more wave action or boat wakes, you'll get more erosion of the shoreline from those water conditions. Or if your intertidal zone and your marsh is very narrow, if the soil area is very unstable and exposed, and or it's very developed, you might have a more structural practice. I'm sorry, everything keeps jumping ahead. The great thing was Erin showed you this great image, and it shows you just the variety of shoreline stabilization options. So when we're talking about living shorelines, we're talking about the practices more on the left-hand side that include the vegetation as well as sand and other structural elements like core logs, the sills, and the sills could be stone or they could be oyster castles. When you get into the breakwater kind of conditions, then you start looking at maybe building up the beaches behind the breakwaters, and you have a lot higher wave action, and it goes all the way over to the most hardened structures. And you may need to use the hardened structures because you have a working waterfront and very high energy settings. So it will depend, the practice that you choose will depend on the site conditions, and the costs go up as you go from left to right. The cost of the services, the cost of materials, etc. You also got to see this great reference as well. It was put together by NOAA, and it just talks about why we want to promote living shorelines, all the benefits that we get from living shorelines, and where you lose those benefits when you harden the shorelines. And because we're Wetlands Watch and Elizabeth River Project, we definitely want to talk about elevation and habitat types that come along, that are there along a tidal shoreline, and how connected they are to the tidal range and water levels, and how they're connected not just along the shoreline, but from the water's edge inland. And the goal of the living shoreline is to maintain that connection. And when you have erosion, for instance, at the water's edge, you might have a disconnected shoreline. The other thing is, if you have a hardened shoreline at the water's edge, then as sea level rises, those water level dependent features cannot migrate inlands. But with living shorelines, it allows, basically, as the water level rises with sea level rise, it allows the mud flats to migrate inland, the emergent marsh to migrate up a little higher if it's allowed sufficient time with sea level rise. And then that also goes with the concept of thinking about the buffer, like the Chesapeake Bay Protection Area buffer or the critical area buffers, how important they are, keeping them natural so that they can adapt over time as well with changes in the shoreline ecosystem. This is just that same image in reality. So here's an example of what does a mudflat look like? What does the tidal marsh look like? What does a riparian forest buffer look like? And look at how there's this kind of connectivity from the water all the way into the forest, and trying to maintain that connectivity. And Barbara's going to take over from here.
Yeah, so to sort of expand on what Shereen's talked about, we have some general goals for why we want to use living shorelines versus other methods of shoreline stabilization. So looking at it from a sustainable perspective, if we can change the physical forces that are attacking a shoreline, we talked about erosion being a natural process. But when you have a home, for instance, in Norfolk that is 40 feet from the water's edge and their shoreline is actively eroding, they don't really care whether or not erosion is a natural force. They just know it's something they need to correct. So if we can decrease that incoming wave energy, if we can slow down the impact from the water's edge, but also from behind, so between a property, a house, and a shoreline, that area where water is flowing down, that runoff, can also cause erosion from the backside. So looking at wetlands and buffer plantings as a way to change those forces is important. We also want to think about the foundation of how we design these projects. So looking at it from, just like Shereen said, an opportunity to create a connected shoreline. So not just putting in a wetland and then a bulkhead behind the wetland so that that's then disconnected and the wetland can't migrate over time. Looking at ways for us to have a wetland flow into a buffer or flow into a property, a yard, so that they can migrate inland over time and continue protecting the property. We also want to look at the positive impacts over time. So the value that that project can provide for a property, for a river, for an ecosystem across the board. And this is sort of a way to address those exact things. So I love these pictures. I'm there in the very bright pink raincoat, standing on the shoreline with Jim Cahoon of Bay Environmental, whose name you've heard a couple of times today, and you will hear several times more. They've been a massive help for us at Elizabeth River Project and several other organizations. This was a site over on Indian River, over on the eastern branch of the Elizabeth in Chesapeake, where you can see they had active erosion. They have a fairly significant steepness to their yard where they were actively mowing all the way to the water's edge. This is something that we see a lot where people don't realize that they're actually mowing wetland grasses, or if they do, they don't think anything of it until you get to the severity that these folks had. So we worked with Jim and his guys to create this design, put in the core logs that you see out front, which are the shredded coconut fiber, biodegradable option instead of using a revetment or oyster castles in a place like this that is so soupy that they would have instantly sunk. But they also just didn't have enough wind and wave energy to need that kind of stabilization out front. So in this case, it was planted with low marsh and high marsh wetland grasses. And then we came in that middle photo after 6 months because they actually had some rills forming in the sand where water was rushing down that backyard and creating pathways through the silt fence. So this was one example where we did have to come in and do some sand replacement, get that back stable, and then put in a significant riparian buffer planting to slow down that water. And then after 1 year, it's a really beautiful project. And this is an example that you'll see later today. This homeowner actually just called me an hour ago that we'll talk about, but this is one where we had that conversation of do we do a living shoreline all the way across the property, or do we look at other options? So these two photos are both at the same home. On the left is on the left side of the dock, on the right, that revetment, where on the left, they were okay with grading back to create the elevations that we needed to have a low marsh and a high marsh. But on the right, they just weren't. It was a bit more unstable. It was closer to where their home is now, and they just didn't want to give up any more yard space. And it's funny looking back now that the homeowners say, actually, I wish we would have done a living shoreline all the way across. And we do have examples too of large sites that can add a lot of habitat value. I know we talk about some of these smaller residential living shorelines that have a lot of impact at one property in particular, but we've also been able to do some really massive projects. This one in particular at Money Point is down on the southern branch in Chesapeake. It was a two-phase project that took about 1.5 years, and it's 7 acres of restored wetland. They did dredging to pull out, I think it was about 80,000 tons of contaminated sediment, and then capped it with clean sand, and then planted it with wetland grasses. And now 10 years later, thank heaven, it is thriving, and it's got a ton of native plant species. It's great habitat value. So we can see it on a large scale success and small. So you guys might have shorelines that look like this. You might have some that look like some of the photos we'll show later. But we really just wanted to give an overall perspective of why we do these things and what our motivations are.
So do you have any questions that you'd like to ask us, or would you like us to get into some more details about permitting or other kinds of erosion, samples of shoreline erosion?
Generally, the kind of erosion that we look at in the creeks and smaller waterways that empty into the James River in our area around Williamsburg and James City County, a lot of the problem comes from runoff as opposed to the rising seawater. We're in very short spaces where you don't have a lot of room to work. So I would think that something like the koi logs would work better, but I'm not sure.
Well, actually, this particular design, see where the really fluffy grasses are? They
Yeah.
were having some erosion problems from the land after they installed these castles, the oyster castles. So they actually, I think they went back, Barbara, and correct me if I'm wrong, but they actually went back in and added some poor logs in there.
Yeah, so around the right side of this, around the left side of the photo that you see, it actually transitions from oyster castles to core logs, because again, they don't have enough fetch on that side. The access was tighter, and it was a bit of a more steep slope to get down. But yeah, in between the stand-up straight wetland grasses and the ones that are falling over the panicum, we went in and stabilized that with an additional core log.
Mm-hmm.
Which, knowing that it would biodegrade and that it wouldn't stay there forever, that was the goal.
Right.
As I said, we have other slides that we can share. We also have a list of common questions. So if you'd like, Barbara could go down this list and give you the "it depends" answer.
I can.
No, although I have limited experience with it, I do definitely understand that. Our input as master gardeners have always been trying to reduce the runoff. And then we pass it to soil and water conservation people to come up with answers. And so now we're trying to get into the come up with answers ourselves, or help at least.
Yeah. As Shereen said, the answer is normally it depends. Every site is pretty different. We've done some projects at houses that are next door to each other, and even them having such similar conditions, it's always a little bit different. So every project should have its own site-specific design, plan, construction process for how long a project actually takes once you get it going. The permit process could take 3 to 4 months. Normally in COVID, it could take a little bit longer. As far as plants getting established, it could take one growing season, so a full spring through to the next spring.
Yeah.
Sometimes we see projects get planted out in the fall or in the really late summer. The only real issue with that is you run the risk on some of those smaller creeks, on some of those smaller areas of an ice sheet forming, like in the 30-degree weather that we keep having. And if those plants are so young that they haven't established their root systems, they can more easily be pulled out when that ice sheet moves with the tide. So maintenance is really heavily dependent on each site as well. If you have a situation like that, your maintenance would be going back in and replanting in the next spring. We have a lot of homeowners talk to us about the amount of trash that they remove from their shoreline after their wetland is planted. Marshes do a really good job at capturing trash, at capturing a rack line after a storm comes through. So pine straw, pieces of wood, things that will float in and get stuck. Something else that we do that I think a lot of people do is putting up goose exclusion fencing or waterfowl exclusion fencing for curious geese and ducks to keep them out, because otherwise you are planting a buffet for those guys of freshly planted grasses. We normally keep that fencing up for 2 full growing seasons, but that fencing can also take a beating in a storm. It can fall over. Sometimes it'll need to be stood back up. And there are occasional amendments that are needed, sort of like with the photos that we had of the Chesapeake property, where we had to go back in and put more sand in after that was experiencing that erosion from behind. But overall, it's not very much in terms of maintenance, unless you have a major failing, unless something gets blown out in a storm, coral logs fall away, oyster castles fall away. But those are the more extensive projects. Something else that we get, oh no, go ahead, Shereen.
I was actually just gonna say something about the tidal flooding.
Oh yeah, go for it.
Yeah, so one of the things that when I talk about resiliency or adaptation to sea level rise and how living shorelines are resilient, they are resilient in the fact that they can manage flooding and bounce back, but they don't stop tidal flooding. They subdue it. So it subdues, and the vegetation and any structure in there will subdue the wave action and subdue the tidal flooding, but it's meant to flood, actually. You know, a tidal shoreline, the waters fluctuate daily. And so the plants are adapted to those conditions, and they're meant to undergo those conditions. And most of the research has shown that they just bounce back. They manage the flooding and manage the storm surge, but it isn't like it's creating a barrier. So I think that that's something also to understand as you, for instance, are talking to property owners and you're considering a property that's close to the water's edge. They may have concerns because of that.
Yeah. And Steve, you actually mentioned a good point in the chat about the dynamics of tidal forces making this different from freshwater systems. We do see living shorelines being done in ponds. Systems like floating wetlands can be done. The city of Norfolk has done that in a couple places. It is a bit different. So that's more like a retrofit than a living shoreline in some cases, where it's fully changing the system that they have in place. So yeah, it can be a bit different.
Okay.
It doesn't operate on a schedule. I mean, high tides, low tides.
Right.
But
it operates on
it
Mother
does-
Nature still.
Yeah, it still functions, but it's kind of like you're at the end of the drainage.
Mhm.
You know, and that all is reinforced by things that happen upstream, but it always recycles, at least as far as precipitation or hydrology.
Yeah.
Just it's not salty or brackish, and a better suitable environment. Erosion typically upstream goes downstream, but
Yeah.
then when you flood downstream and things rise, all that sediment or any debris then just wants to move its way back upstream.
Yeah, and we've done some shorelines, and we've looked at a lot of potential sites that are near stormwater outfalls that already have existing revetments that have a lot of sediment and also have a lot of freshwater input after rain events, where homeowners really want to do oyster castles or they really want to do oyster gardening. And it's hard to tell them, look, I know you're on the Lafayette, but your salinity really isn't that high because of where you are. We also see a lot of opportunity for invasives in those spaces where if we were to come in and plant a living shoreline, for instance, you would have to fight very hard with already existing Phragmites, for instance, that loves those stormwater outfalls. As long as it's sunny, they can take over, and you would really have to fight hard. So there's always those situations where where we say it depends. One on how willing a homeowner or a property owner is to fight the invasives that are there, but also how much is it worth it? If it's a really established stand of Phragmites, for instance, that's across an entire acre, and your neighbors have it and their neighbors have it, is it worth your time and energy to try and fight it off if you know it will always come back? So every site is very different.
I would also say that, as Anne mentioned, you often have two different forces, as you were talking about, Steve. You have water from the land flowing out that can cause erosion, shoreline erosion. And you have the tidal fluctuations or storm surge or boat wakes that can cause shoreline erosion. So part of the decision-making process is the source of erosion from the water's edge or from the land? Can you stop the erosion first by just installing a buffer, for instance, and have a way for the water to get filtered and slowed down from the rooftop to the water's edge? Or is there a need to also do both? Or would a living shoreline, be the corrective action? I stopped sharing my screen just because I couldn't see everybody. And I want to make sure that people had an opportunity to ask questions, but we also do have like a bunch of other slides associated with cost share programs in the area and all the legal jurisdictions along the shoreline. It was alluded to a little bit in the in some of the presentations about the Chesapeake Bay program and the VMRC areas, and so we can show those slides as well if you'd like us to. But is there any particular topic that you're most curious about?
You have one question or comment. So I deal primarily in upstream hydrology. And what I notice is that, well, one, there's the like TMDLs or any other water quality concerns, but also mixing the water column and kind of trying to agitate the laminar flow of hot and cold water, salty and fresh water. I see those dynamics, they exist more frequently at the edges or in those ecotones in between these two ecological contexts. So in that way, I see not only with the erosion potentiality, but also just like suitable habitat and so in water quality, if we're not managing things, at the point source, then it gets flushed downstream. Depends on how long it takes to work its way through soils and aquatic ecosystems, but eventually it ends in, these basins. So my issue is then that to tie those things together, we think in terms of the Chesapeake Bay bioregion in an expanded context where a lot of it's not shoreline, but it influences directly kind of those variables that are much more difficult to solve or mitigate when they get all the way down to the basin. And
Right.
I'm just curious because it feels like these things go in tandem, but they are distinctly different, like engineering considerations or specification.
Yeah, so when you go inland, you're going to be looking at other types of practices. The one common thing across all the landscapes, whether you're inland or on the shoreline, is the benefit and value of buffers. And so there, in addition to the living shoreline or shoreline management, best management practices for the watershed implementation plan, we're really working on buffer restoration and replanting buffers. And that's why in the coastal area, the buffers are so important and they're protected through the Chesapeake Bay Act. And then there's other stream restoration type practices. There's, shoot, I can't think of the name of this. There's this one practice that you do in outside the streams. Regenerative stormwater conveyance systems, which are almost like an inland living shoreline in my mind. It's, you build it into the interface between the water coming off the land and water in those streams, and it has living materials in it, and it uses the living materials to treat the water. So you're absolutely right. And the thing is that you lose a lot of opportunities when you get into the coastal plain, because we have tidal storm surge and tidal fluctuations, and there's an opportunity. Living shorelines provide a big opportunity to manage sediment as well as nitrogen and phosphorus at the water's edge, because that's where a lot of people are living, is at the water's edge, at a big water's edge. And so how can we increase the use of those practices and do them properly is a big thing that we're trying to deal with in the Hampton Roads area and other coastal areas of Virginia. Does anybody else have any questions? And Steve also
I have a comment to make.
Yeah.
It's Barb. As a master gardener water steward, I go to homeowners, and most of our homeowners live in a situation where their property may flow into a stream or something, a secondary source. And they're incredibly aware that they have this situation, but they get discouraged because they realize that they can only do something to mitigate the problem on their own property. And it's an aggregate responsibility with other homeowners that also feed into that stream, and they get discouraged, and they feel like, well, I can do what I can on my own property, but other than a political influence, I can't influence what other people are doing or even their awareness of it. So that's one situation that we just have to deal with and do our best. Thank you.
As a strategy, I think if you look at the Elizabeth River project, they tend to work in communities, like neighborhoods. and try and get, you know, improvement by 1,000 practices, basically. I kind of flip.
Literally,
you know,
we
say
just did
death
our
by 1,000
1,000th
cuts.
project.
You want to get improvement by 1,000 practices. So it's if you can work with a watershed group or start a community-based social marketing campaign, like the Elizabeth River Project has River Star Homes, and James River Association has the River Hero Homes, then you can basically create a movement where you just focus on that one, like all the homes around that creek. And then you take one homeowner and you have that homeowner set an example, and you tell the world what an amazing example they have, you know, accomplished. And there are cost share programs for that. So, you know, they're just like their cost share for Living Shorelines, VCAP, Virginia Conservation Assistance Program, has cost share for those stormwater practices. So there are opportunities to look at things cohesively and target things in a way that looks at a whole community and makes an impact in one little area, like one little stream or one little watershed. And you will find also, you can't use the same practice for every site. Every site is unique. Just like every living shoreline site's unique, every property, every house has a different drainage pattern than the next one. It may have different soils. It may have different wants and desires of the homeowners. And so that's something we teach our certified landscape professionals and other professionals. It's not just landscape, that each site is unique and you should evaluate the site. And if you're working with Karen During and the Soil and Water Conservation District in James City County, she's done something similar in the Northern Neck, and she's taught the people that she works with about that, you know, concept. Each site is unique.
Yeah, and if you're able to, in those conversations, change their perspective at all, you know, make it less of a, this is a challenge we'll never get past, and into more of an opportunity. So when we're on those site visits, you know, saying, here's a bunch of my cards, you can tell your neighbors about us if they're interested, if you guys communicate regularly, presenting, because we have the capacity to, presenting to homeowners associations, to civic leagues. If we're out on a site, we just did this last week. We were out on a site visit with one homeowner, and another one was walking by, walking their dog. And I made a point of when we were leaving to say, hey, how are you? We're with the Elizabeth River Project. It's a new neighborhood. We know everybody has a lot of questions about your shorelines. Is there anything we can help you with? And we ended up talking to him for 30 minutes. And he did not have a positive opinion of his shoreline or his neighbors. And we were able to change that. So yes, using those opportunities is very important. But I see that, we absolutely see that a lot, where people get really discouraged.
And I think the benefit, you know, of being part of a collaborative like this is you start meeting other groups that are working on similar initiatives in your own area, and you join forces and work together and have the same messaging. So when you have a bunch of different groups running around all doing their own little thing, you lose the impact of the messaging, and sometimes you find that there's conflicting messaging. So, you know, it's really important, if you want to make an impact, to be unified in your messaging and unified with other groups that are doing the same work that you are. And maybe you decide that you want to tackle the stormwater stuff and pass on the shoreline efforts to somebody else who has better understanding, but you can work in concert with one another. So anything else?
That was very helpful.
Good.
I'll show you the shoreline jurisdictions. Let's see. Where'd it go? Oh, there it is.
Yeah. we've
Can you
seen
see that?
Yeah.
Yeah,
So this is, you know,
Oh, Shereen,
Um,
can you put it into presenter mode?
sure.
Or sorry, slideshow?
Yeah, so this is, you know, Steve, as I said, this is Virginia's tidal shoreline regulatory process or regulatory agencies and authorities. And there's overlapping authorities. So like you might have a local board that manages any disturbance to the Chesapeake Bay protection area, and then another one that manages any disturbance to the wetlands, and they handle the living shorelines, and another group handles the buffer. And you have to go, there's a joint permit application process. And in Virginia, the property rights are to the high tide. Is it high tide?
Low tide.
Low tide. I think
Yeah.
in Maryland, it's high tide. So that, so there's this whole area that's kind of, you know, on private property.
Mm-hmm.
And so, but then as soon as you step into the water, you're in it's owned by public. It's owned by the
Yeah.
state.
And that brings up a really interesting point too. And if you guys are master gardeners, you probably run into this as well, where if you meet with a homeowner, they say, oh, I own, you know, my property line stretches all the way across the creek. When in reality, they cannot do a living shoreline that covers the entire creek and crosses a channel, because one, why would they? But two, because that's the state's river bottom. It is not theirs. They may pay property tax for it, but it is not theirs. So we've had some situations where we have to get permission from VMRC to do a project that extends past mean low water. But there's also some situations too where you run into, I think it's Section 8, where if you are anywhere near an intercoastal channel, then you have to get permission from federal government to do your project at all. So there are some situations where things can get very nitpicky and it can slow down a permitting process.
So there isn't any average time for permitting process?
For us, it's typically 3 months. So when you
Oh,
send
okay.
these permits, for us, it goes through, and I think you actually have a slide on it, Shereen, that shows the different agencies. So when we do a JPA, a joint permit application, there are different versions that are meant to make it an easier process for living shorelines. So if you were just doing a core log and no oyster castles or no sill structure with rocks, it's meant to be a living shoreline permit 1, which should be easier and slower to get through, or sorry, quicker to get through. But it still has to be sent over to Virginia Marine Resource Commission, who then shares it with everybody else. So if you have to get one from the Army Corps of Engineers or from your local wetlands board, they will submit it to all of those different partners. It's really
Okay.
important if you're doing the design, or if you're working with a marine contractor or someone to do the designs, that they be done well and clearly. Designs that are to scale are even more important, as Seamus, I'm sure, is saying in their other breakout room right now. But showing clear plan views that give as much information up front as possible, as well as cross sections that show as much information as possible, helps speed the process along. It prevents a lot of that back and forth questions that they'll have along the way.
Okay.
Yeah,
Thank you.
and actually, there's a general permit that is an expedited process in Virginia.
Mhm.
Because of when they made the living shorelines the preferred practice, shoreline management practice, they created certain types of living shorelines, the ones that were to the more green side of the scale, can undergo an expedited review and approval process.
Mhm.
So, but even so, it is important to make sure that you have well-developed permit applications and you have all the information you need to
Mhm.
submit that permit. So,
And that is one of the benefits too that Erin was talking about with the SEAS program, that they can review your designs and your project plan for you for free, which is the Virginia program from DCR, and they can give you recommendations and changes that you might need. We can also do that for folks that are on the Elizabeth, but that is a really great thing to have, is to have somebody, and especially someone that won't charge you for it, to look at what you have planned and make those recommendations.
Mhm.
And I
Thank you.
believe that can happen in Maryland as well, with the Maryland agencies, Steve.
Good.
Any other? I can show you more examples of more erosion problems.
Sure, sure. Bring it
Yeah, if you
on.
see any that look like yours.
Yeah, these are really hard ones.
There are some horror stories out there. I'm really excited about this.
Yeah, good.
Yeah, we see a lot that are more like the first
Undercutting.
photo. Yeah. So like on the Elizabeth, for instance, and there's a lot that look like this, where from the top of the bank, someone says, you know, I had a tree fall and I didn't realize until after it that from the yard side view, it looked fine, but from the water's edge, you see that it's been fully undercut. All the tree's roots are exposed. Or you'll see just a sheer scarp where you have, again, that active erosion where you can see soil actively falling away in storm events.
Mhm.
Not name names, but there are shelves that are 30 feet tall at low tide around where I live currently.
Mhm.
That it's absurd, and
Yeah.
it's enforcement. I wish it was not a carrot and stick situation, but for some reason, folks are able to skirt around that ownership thing.
Yeah. Well, and there's also a lot of opportunities like this where you have vegetation that has been purposefully removed, right? And you end up with these giant banks. That's something that James River Association is actually dealing with, and I think Ryan might touch on it. In our talks with them, we don't have very many shorelines like that on the Elizabeth. We see maybe 10 foot up to 15, and that's pretty rare. But on the James all the way up, they're going to see a lot more shorelines that are like that have significant erosion scarps, and probably no or little opportunity to grade back. So they have to come up with some more creative solutions for living shoreline projects.
So we're actually getting ready to, I think, pop back into the main room and break for lunch. I'm going to grab some lunch, but I will come back and sit and eat in front of my computer. And if people have more questions, and Steve, I actually have some resources, links for resources that I will share when
I forgot to push record.
I gotcha.
I'm so sorry. You did?
I got it.